organize themselves around support for data management. And building these at I'm going to skip over these really quick because I'm out of time, and you all probably know about most of these. First of all, there's NextGen. I've been privileged to participate in a little bit in one of the groups, the Data Storage Strategy Working Group, which is working on the storage component, and that includes goals for things like information lifecycle management and long-term archiving, which I think will go a long way towards providing the sort of standardized services that we need backing up the creation of these plans. There's the LSA data classification tool. This is a screenshot of the paper version. This is currently being turned into a web-based decision tree that's going to help researchers classify their data to inform the decisions that are made by the IT managers when they're provisioning services to use for managing that data. DMP tool is a collaborative project. ICPSR is a partner on that. And I think this has the potential to become a useful tool for collaboration among all the different units that need to have a hand in provisioning services to support data management. And now I'm going to turn it over to Anne, who is going to explain the SEAD project and how that fits into the picture. Thanks.
Interesting, we all called our presentations CI days. Okay. Could I just do a quick check to see how many people here are, what do I want to say, I call them domain researchers, but somebody in like physics or material science or ecology? Okay. And other people are in information science or computer information science, information technology? Okay. Just kind of wanted to get a sense of who was out there. I think I can speak to both, to all sets, hopefully. So the data management plan approach that Alex and Jake talked about is an attempt to get researchers to think about the long-term management and preservation of their data. And with the sort of thoughtful approaches like Alex and Jake are taking to this data management plan idea, I think that it can result in some positive change. As someone who has studied the sort of social and technical issues around data sharing for a number of years, I'm skeptical about a sort of mandated approach to data sharing and data curation. I think the best type of data sharing, management, and reuse happens when it's driven by the needs of the research and when it fits with the practices of the researchers. So for example, large data collections, tools for working with data, standardized metadata practices and stuff are more common in say, it's not possible to do climate research without having access to global climate data, and those data are not owned by any one person or institution. So I think that's an example of a place where infrastructure exists because it's necessary to do the science. Oops, that changed. Bear with me a second. There we go. So as Jacob's presentation in particular also showed, there are many challenges with data management plans. So for one, they presume that all or at least most research data is worth preserving. In my mind, this is a questionable assumption. Out of the universe of data generated, only a portion may be worth the effort to preserve. Admittedly, it's hard to anticipate what those data are. I think, though, that we need to find other ways to figure this out than through sort of a shotgun approach. Data management plans also treat all data as if they were the same. But there are actually many different kinds of data, and those kinds can vary based on, as Alex was saying, the kind of intellectual property issues, privacy issues, confidentiality issues, as well as being experimental data, survey data, sensor data. So it's also the case that data aren't simply the end products of research, that they are something that evolve over time. So think about data that come off of a sensor. Those data are then post-processed in some way, and then perhaps they end up in some version in a publication in a journal article. Whereas data management plan sort of treats all of these things the same. Another issue that came out in Jake's presentation is that there needs to be an infrastructure that facilitates the management and sharing of data. And there are many aspects to this infrastructure, as he also talked about. There's tools to work with data. There are places to deposit data. One of the biggest challenges, I think, as he pointed out, is that in many research areas, there isn't just a place for you to put your data that other people can get access to. There also need to be human resources. So again, this infrastructure has to exist in many different kinds of ways. So NSF being, the people who sort of developed the data management plan approach, and NIH as well. I know most about the NSF approach. But obviously, NSF is filled with a lot of smart people, and a lot of those people are researchers themselves who come from the domains that they're mandating these data management plans for. So I think they recognize that this is just one approach to getting people to think about data sharing and data management. Another approach that they've taken is in the mid-2000s, late 2000s, they started a program called DataNet. And the goals of DataNet were to sort of, as you see listed here, to sort of develop a new type of organization to think about data, and that they would integrate expertise from all of the different areas that you need in order to deal with data management effectively, including people who are part of the research domain in which the data are generated. So it's about trying to provide preservation, but it's also about trying to meet user needs. Needs are not the same in every domain. So it's a very large scale approach, and that incorporates research as well to try to get to deal with some of the tough things that have been talked about. So now I want to move on to just talking about one of these projects within the DataNet program. And I want to do that in a way that I hope will connect, not to just talk about the project for the sake of talking about the project, but to talk about it as a way to address some of the challenges that have come up so far. So each of the data nets that have been funded, and there have been 5 funded so far, 2 were funded in 2009, and 3 were just funded this fall. Ours is, one of those is based here at the School of Information. We'll talk just a little bit more about who's involved in it in a moment. But each of those has a sort of research problem area that it focuses on. And SEED, which stands for Sustainable Environment Actionable Data, is focused on the science of sustainability. So sustainability is sort of a new and kind of growing area of research that looks at the interactions between nature and humans. And if you've been following some of the stuff going on campus, you know that President Coleman has a pretty active initiative on campus sustainability. So the interactions between nature and people are very complex in most cases. So for example, where people choose to live impacts how the land is used in a particular area, or how the land is used in a particular area might choose will affect whether people live there or not. So knowledge about these interactions is very important for environmental reasons, social reasons, policy reasons. And understanding them requires data inherently from many different domains and many different scales. And so it's a kind of a rich area. It's an area where naturally people want to find and reuse and integrate other types of data. But there are a number of challenges in this sort of a large problem space of sustainability science. And that's that you have many different disciplines, so you have many different cultures of sharing, you have many different types of data, you have survey data, you have environmental data, so you have social data, physical data. You have lots of small data sets. You might have a few large data sets. So Jake talked about ICPSR, the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Science Research that provides access to a lot of large ongoing long-term surveys. So you do have those kinds of data sets. But what you also have are many individual small group investigators who have, had those kind of, what I actually have, notebooks and interview transcripts and things that are just, me working on a particular project. There's no place to really deposit those things. And there's just heterogeneity in every conceivable fashion. So another way to kind of think about this problem is what we call the long tail, and you've probably heard about the long tail in other contexts. So you have many small data sets gathered by many individuals or small groups of people, and that together makes up a majority of the data that are there. And so while the aggregate demand for data in general may be large and growing, the demand for any particular data set may be very small and very focused. So to try to spend a lot of money, a lot of time managing those data in a very kind of heavyweight way through a data management plan or something, for example, seems to be a little bit off in terms of cost versus value, perhaps. But at the same time, if you could get access to those data and you could combine them together, you could have something potentially very valuable. So it's a matter about sort of balancing the amount of time that you put into curating these data versus and money that you spend versus their sort of value overall. So often people think of Amazon as an example of something that can make you can have a book and you can put it on Amazon, and that way people can find it, even though the demand for that particular book overall may be small, it's findable through Amazon, where they sell, many bestsellers, but they also sell things that are out in the long tail. So there's some of us who've been working together for a while and been kind of interested in this particular problem of long tail data, where you have many very heterogeneous data sets, many small types of data sets. And in the spirit of the DataNet program, we come from many different areas. So Margaret Hedstrom is the PI here at the University of Michigan School of Information. Margaret is an archivist background, particularly focusing on digital preservation. Then we have computer scientists, information technologists. Praveen Kumar is a scientist working in the area of hydrology and science of sustainability in general in Illinois. So we have a very interdisciplinary group ourselves, and we also have involvement of ICPSR here on campus. So I'm just gonna, the goals and strategy that we're kind of using in SEED are kind of a bit of mother and apple pie at this particular point in time. We just got funded on October 1st, so we're a project, there is no system for me to show you. What we have is, I think, some sort of what I think of as concepts that drive SEED, that try to address some of the challenges that I've talked about. And so we are in this, so I'll just kind of show these next two slides, the kind of goals and the strategies, but then kind of just talk through some examples of, an example of kind of what I mean by that. Because SEED doesn't really exist, and because it's critical that we develop it with people who would be the potential users of it, how it's actually going to look in, say, 18 months from now is very much an open question. So we have, as I'll say at the end, we just started. We have 18 months to develop a prototype in. And so during this first 18 months, we're kind of focusing on these three goals. The thing I just want to emphasize over and over again that we emphasize in our project, that it has to be built around the needs of people who would be the users. Beyond that, we have this active and social curation idea, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then lastly, there's a sort of long-term preservation component part to SEED. So there's basically three different parts. One is making sure we build something that's usable to the potential users of the system. And there's active and social curation and long-term preservation. I'll spend most time on the second part. So part of the strategy, and again, I'll talk more about this, but the time when most of the information is known about data is when people are working with it, when it's being generated, when it's been collected, when people are analyzing it. And so if you want to try to capture metadata, the best time to do it is when people are actively working with it. But if you ask people to fill out long forms and describe their data and stuff, it's probably not going to happen. So we want to try to have ways to capture that information, but in a lightweight way that can, so some of it can be, metadata can be captured automatically. Some of it can be, input, but not in a way that takes you 3 hours to do. So the idea is that we try to capture as much of that information while people are working actively with the data as we can. So instead of thinking about what you do with your data at the end of your study when it's all over, you think about it beforehand. Again, just talking about research areas are different. And so there isn't a one, the boilerplate kind of problem that Jake talked about. So let me talk a little bit about this active and social curation notion. Again, it's partly working with people and with data while they are actively working with them. And using information to automatically capture it so it can be available later. If you can do some of these things in a more lightweight way than filling out a long data management plan or something, you can save, try to balance that cost versus value. So let me just kind of give some examples of what we envision that how seed might work. So you could have, as I said, the kind of part where a scientist has data, maybe they have a collaboration with people, and that is data that they're working with within the collaboration. They're not sharing it outside of it, although they could choose to if they wanted. So we're trying as much as possible to build off of existing tools, because we simply don't have the budget to develop a whole brand new set of tools, but we want to use things that are lightweight, that people can use, that add value to them while they're working with their data. So that's kind of one part of it. The other part of it is that people choose to share, or people find data from multiple sources. They create an aggregated data set from that. They can contribute it back into this active repository where other people can sort of, right now there's very often, you might deposit data that you've generated yourself in some sort of repository, but not very often do you see the sort of aggregated, consolidated, other products that people create out of having integrated data together. So this would be another place where people could contribute those kinds of data products back. People could use those, comment on them. So there's sort of a facilitating use piece of this. People can also find data or find people who have collected data. So there's sort of multiple connections, a kind of social network, data network collection, so that you can find data that other people have used, find out how they used it, trace back to see who else has used those data, who is that network of people that those people work with. So just many different ways to find, learn, find data, find people. And then we think that, one of the problems I talked about at the beginning is that, there's this problem of what data should we retain? What data are worth, are valuable for the long term? What data maybe you could benefit from some more structured metadata, have ongoing use for the long term, whether that's 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. It's always hard to answer that question, and I've talked with scientists and they say, well, it's hard for me to know what data might be useful. I mean, sometimes they can answer that question. Sometimes it's really hard to know. But our goal is to, within the sort of context of SEED, to let researchers answer that question for themselves as a community, to try to determine what data have ongoing value. And some of that will come from seeing what people reuse and contribute back. But once there's been a scientist or some maybe community of researchers in a particular area decide that something is worth preserving, there will be a mechanism to take data from the active content repository, the sort of short-term active place, into longer-term repositories. So, trying to give people a place to put their data for the long term as specified in the data management plan types of things. And our goal for that is to use the library institutional repositories. So Jacob was talking about the University of Virginia institutional repositories. So libraries are getting very interested in the management and preservation of data. And so we would work in partnership with libraries to become sort of the longer term archive. So as I said, we're very much at the beginning. A lot of what I've talked about probably isn't a clear picture in your mind, is partly because we're working with sustainability science researchers right now to try to figure out how might some of these concepts look in something that we would actually develop using existing tools. So we have funding to develop a prototype in 18 months. If we're not successful, we will wind down. We're focusing on working with researchers in the Upper Great Lakes area, particularly in hydrology, agriculture, to kind of develop some of these concepts, put some things in front of them, get their feedback. And then if we're successful in years 3 through 5, we would sort of grow out in terms of the types of data, the users, functionality. So in other words, we're not ready to, we don't have an infrastructure that exists as a place for you to put your data, but we would very much welcome, if you are in the area of science of sustainability research, to have people who would be willing to work with us to help us sort of make real what SEED might look like. Also welcome comments from people in technology and computer information science. It's really much an open slate, I think, as you can see. So in summary, SEED wants to deal with some of these challenges by providing tools and services to work with data as they evolve. Recognizing that data change over time, and it's not about just the end products, it's not about just what ends up in a journal article. Want to facilitate that ongoing use of data, help people determine enable researchers to kind of determine as a community what data should be saved, and then provide means for sort of moving data that have ongoing value from sort of active use to longer term preservation. And we do have a website that is up now, so if you want to learn more about it, I invite you to go there. Thank you very much.
Don't be shy.
So I come from a research group where we do 100% simulations, and maybe in the course of writing a research paper, you do 1,000 simulations, and maybe over half of them just lead to dead ends. And then maybe the other half go to creating a figure in the paper. And I don't have a specific question, but just if you have any comments about, well, how does data management work into this? And just to put a number on things, we might generate, say, 100 gigabytes to a terabyte of data just for one paper. And if you have any comments on that, I'd be happy to hear them.
I guess I'd be interested to know what you think, in terms of, do you want access to people like other researchers like you, if they've done multiple simulations like that? Do you want to have access to be able to sort of look at what they've done? Do you want access just to be able to run, do you want the code and just to be able to rerun that and do your own simulations? Your question is an excellent one, because this is a really difficult area for curators and I think in the next talk, Victoria Stodden will be talking about some of this very challenge. But I think you, as a researcher, you really need to help us kind of figure out, what you would want and what would be valuable to you. So I would be really, do you have any thoughts about that right now? Or
Let's see. I don't know. Right now, I mean, in our field, things are progressing so fast. We're at the point where we can go back and you just from the paper and looking at the parameters and how they set up a simulation, we can rerun someone's entire PhD in a month because the computing is getting so much faster and faster, and my own data sets are so should I say disorganized and hard to follow that. I wouldn't really want anyone to look at them. And so if we're going forward with these data management plans, I have to think about how am I going to organize these things so that they're going to make sense for someone else. And but you asked the question, what would I want to see from someone else? And I guess I don't really have an answer to that right now. I mean, most of the stuff that goes on in our field, the paper is the summary of, someone's looked at this humongous data set and they've found the patterns in it and have published the plots on the patterns. And, maybe at a minimum, I would want the numbers that went into the plot so that I could reproduce a plot and then compare, but I wouldn't necessarily need the entire terabyte of data that went into it.
Yep. I think I think it's important for all of us as, research communities and in my own research community as well to have these, to think about these things and to use them to sort of derive what their requirements should be in these data management plans. And it's not that the answer is going to be there overnight or there is, quote, an answer or a perfect answer, but I think that's the way to approach it. I've had, sometimes I think if something's really complicated to do, someone is just going to redo it. And like you say, your own work is complicated, so someone may not, actually want to rerun everything, actually want to see all the files that you generated, but they just want to be able to understand what you did so they can evaluate it. So providing them with that information instead. I've had other, like in biomedicine, where instrumentation changes so quickly, the data a year from now that you can generate will be, quote, better. And so the likelihood that someone may go back and look, I'm kind of generalizing here, but there are sort of ways that you can kind of think about it. So that's very helpful. Thank you.
Hi, I had several questions, actually. One of my first was with regards to IP concerns, not necessarily affecting what you publish. How does that change with the change from first to invent to first to file?
Can I punt on that? Yeah. Man, I mean that's like an academic paper right there.
Doesn't first to file essentially mean you have to keep your data secret until you apply for patents?
Right, absolutely, because there's this kind of artifice right now in the patent system with the way that you go about registering your patent. So there's this kind of this assumption that if you're the luckily, we haven't actually made that transition yet to a first-to-file system. But yeah, absolutely. If we were to move to that point, it would completely change the way that institutions or anybody with any sort of potentially patentable information is going to secure that prior to making it available. But yeah, to be honest with you, that's something I'd have to probably punt to OTT. They're definitely our licensing specialists. So. Trying to interpret what the impact of changing that patent scheme would be something that they would probably be better suited to comment on. So ultimately, I'm still going to punt.
Okay. I was just curious. Another concern was you mentioned sort of budgeting for sharing data. And for people who generate large amounts of data, say you end up with a 10 terabyte data set, how can you budget when you may have 2 people interested versus 20,000 people interested in your data? I mean, is there a way later to get funding to share your data after the fact if it turns out you came up with a very,
So I think this is one of the reasons why when people higher up in the university talk about provisioning a long-term data archiving service, there's a lot of discussion of making it a public good. It's one reason. Another reason, of course, is that there's not much incentive in a lot of cases to pay for that. But it is hard to know, of course, in advance how much your stuff is going to be used. One thing that I think would help in that regard, again, is having standardized pricing so that you could actually make some assumptions and then price it out based on those assumptions.
I guess one last question regarding metadata. Were you talking about actually making the metadata within your archival system or within the actual data files itself?
So people do it both ways. Like, some data centers, you submit the data, someone helps you fill in some sort of template for the metadata. Others, it's actual, like, a self-describing data format where it's there in the file header. I think there's just a lot of variation in how that's done. Maybe Anne has more other examples of that. I think in either
Yeah.
case, there needs to be support for it. It doesn't get any easier just because you're putting it in one place or the other.
Yeah, I guess there are some data formats obviously that won't take metadata. So unless there is some sort of catalog or some sort of system we're putting the data into, is there some standard or some way we should be attempting to tag data?
Yeah, well, so there are many standards, and one of the parts of the guidance that we put together for the COE was concerned with helping people select the right metadata standard. In some cases, like in the biosciences, those are huge XML schemas that need to be filled in with great amounts of labor, and there are lots of tricks people use to try and get that to happen. Tranche Project, which you may be familiar with, has done a lot of work around that, just figuring out social engineering methods for trying to get people to fill in metadata, which is kind of amazing. But, standards vary, and of course in a lot of areas there is no standard, so then what do you do? That's a really good question that I don't think we answered to anyone's satisfaction in the guidance.
Thank you, everyone. And there'll be a 30-minute break before our final keynote, which will be in this room.